We're really happy to have everybody here. Certainly, it's kind of obviously been a strange couple of weeks, and we've reorganized this to be online, but also we've been thinking a little bit about what we're going to talk about in relation to all of this. But I wanted to start by just kind of introducing performance exchange very quickly to anybody who hasn't kind of been aware of it before. I'm Rose Lejeune and I'm the director. And it was a project that I set up really kind of in conversation with 3 commercial galleries, Vitrine, which Tim Etchells, who's with us tonight, works with, and 17 and Arcade. And it was really kind of born out of some conversations about performance's place kind of within artistic practice and as part of a kind of I guess constellation of mediums, but also as a discrete practice, and thinking about how from a kind of art historical point of view, without museums and without private collectors being able to kind of include that in their collections, then we'd have a really sort of strange version of what contemporary art practice looks like. And I think that that also for us really kind of pertained to questions about the kind of ecosystem of performance and how it gets supported and the different places that it gets presented in and the ways that performance kind of gets viewed in those different kind of presentation spaces. So in a funny way, doing this online becomes a kind of really interesting moment of thinking about what the difference is between presenting or talking online and presenting or talking in real life. And in particular, I guess this idea of groups of people gathering together. So originally Performance Exchange was going to be a series of performances across all these different commercial galleries. So from those 3 initial ones, we also started to kind of accumulate a big group of galleries that would show presentations of artists that they represented and worked with. So that now includes Hollybush Gardens, Kate McGarry, Koenig, London, Union Pacific, Project Native Informant, Richard Saltoun, Spruth Margers, Sadie Coles, David Zwerner. So a really nice group of galleries representing artists across lots of different kinds of performance, but also lots of different generations of practice. And obviously at the moment we're slightly uncertain as to when that's going to now take place. It was scheduled to be in July, but what we wanted to do in the meantime was to really kind of think about what we could do and what would develop the project. So the other side of the project is that we're working with 3 kind of regional museums in the UK to support them to acquire a performance work. And one of the things that we're doing with that is to create these kind of acquisitions documents around how to kind of understand exactly what you are collecting in performance. So it felt like a kind of nice moment also to develop a set of conversations around that and around thinking about how we understand how performance gets collected and how that can be a part of thinking about its kind of distribution and its kind of reimagination across different kind of times and spaces. So this is the second of a series of conversations that we've done. The first was with Paul Mahecki and Ned McConnell from David Roberts Art Foundation. And we're really happy tonight to have, I think, probably 2 of the best people anywhere to think about collecting performance. So as I'm sure everybody knows, Catherine Wood is the Senior Curator of Performance at Tate, and I think has kind of completely sort of spearheaded and led performance in the museum, both in terms of obviously its presentation, but also the research around its collecting. And Tim Etchells, who, as I've said, works with the Vitrine Gallery, but is also the artistic director of the theatre company Forced Entertainment. And as an artist whose work really centers around kind of performativity and liveness and presence and thinking about text and lots of different kinds of screens as well, actually, I think kind of LCD monitors and computer screens and the stage and the page and all of these different kinds of sites. But also Tim and Catherine have worked together, I guess, for over a decade. So I've written this down. So between August 2008 and October 2013, Tim was the recipient of the Legacy Thinker in Residence Award, an initiative instigated by the Live Art Development Agency and Tate Research. And actually, amongst other things, I really recommend his keynote speech that he did as part of the collecting the performative research project, which I think was probably the first kind of major museum research project on collecting and conserving performance art. And obviously, hopefully they can update us a little bit on the work that they've been doing together. But also I know from the conversation we've just been having that there's some kind of nascent thoughts on thinking about what might happen next. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to those guys to kind of be in conversation for a while. They're going to speak for maybe kind of 45 minutes or so, and we'll do some questions at the end. Obviously, we'll kind of have to, hopefully that will work in terms of this kind of webinar format. But I also wanted to say just quickly, we're going to take a quick break at 8 p.m, which is in about 20 minutes from now. Obviously, there's another kind of clap for the NHS scheduled, and we thought it was really important for us to go and do that. And then we'll kind of come back and pick up where we left off. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you guys, and looking forward to listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Thanks so much. And thanks for the nice introductions, and also for setting up this performance exchange project, which just seems so important as part of the whole ecosystem infrastructure in terms of how this kind of work can get made and supported. And that's something we've been collecting performance, like you said, at Tate since we first acquired a work by Roman Ondak, Good Feelings and Good Times, in 2004. We have quite a number of works now, including in the process, Tim's piece, Moving Words, that take the format of a score that can be activated. And I think I feel very aware from working with artists working in this way that that kind of practice falls between many gaps. Firstly, between the kind of object-orientated market side of art generally, even though there have been collectors and museums willing to play the game of collecting performance, it's not very typical so far. And there's a bit of a lack of understanding maybe of how you could acquire work like that, or how you could support the artist. So that side is really important. And I think also challenging the kind of, is it theatre, is it dance, or is it visual art boundary, which is something I'd like to talk with Tim about, because that's a different structure financially and in terms of presentation and touring and festivals. And the two don't tend to meet that often, or don't necessarily support each other that well. And so art performance tends to assume a reliance on market model, even though that doesn't necessarily work for all the artists making work, making art in that mode. And vice versa with the theatre model. It doesn't necessarily support doing things in galleries. So there are lots of gaps, and this seems like a good initiative for sure. But Tim, I wondered if we could maybe just begin by focusing, there's been many points of connection between us at Tate, and even at the very beginning in 2003, the Forced Entertainment project that was shown in collaboration with LADA. But this process where you've worked with me and Isabella Maidment to allow us to acquire Moving Words, a piece of yours that can be performed live in the galleries. And I wondered if you could maybe begin by talking about that and the shape and nature of that piece. And then we could discuss how we've managed to make it acquirable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to do that. I guess, what's interesting to me is that, in a way, I think I come from a place where, on one level, the assumption has been around work, performance work, that it's sort of, the work with Forced Entertainment has been made with and in that group, and it's been made on the bodies of and with the presences of the authorship, creative input of that particular group of people. So it's tended to be that we haven't distributed that in any other form other than that we will go and do it somewhere, and that's quite different than the model that exists mostly in theatre, where It's certainly within the sort of literary theatre, playwrights write plays, which then, let's say, anybody can pick up and do, and it becomes a kind of sense of exchange around the text, which is a sort of primary object, and the performance, which is then a sort of interpretation or a kind of spin of that. In the forced entertainment work, the tendency has been to think, you know, very opposite to that, and to say, well, the work in a sense rests on the bodies of and the presences of the group, and that's been really important for us. And in the original sort of development of my work, which sort of has led to Moving Words, that was also the origin, was that I was doing things. I started a whole series of improvised language performances, sort of independently of the group. I think the first one that I did was in 2014. And I started at that point working with, you know, fragments of language, phrases or sentences or little bits of narrative that I'd collected. And that kind of collecting of language is really kind of a very key part of my practice, I think. And the language that I collect shows up in... Sorry?
On your computer screen, on your computer, you showed me your word stream once, which was extraordinary, of things you're recording every day.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, in a way, I figured out, I think, in 2014 that probably the longest established and most consistent part of my practice as an artist, working in all the different areas that I work, is that I collect language, you know, that I write down fragments of overheard conversation, stuff from the newspaper, cut paste from online, things that I've invented, stuff from movies. And I have, which I would have showed you, Catherine, it's a Word file, which is basically a sort of bottomless pit into which everything that I overhear or read or am gripped by kind of gets written in nothing other than a sort of accumulating, sedimenting kind of pile. And I began to do some performances in 2014 using that material as a kind of source, all of these fragments. And one of the ways that that manifested was in the work that I did with Boris Sharmatz in different places, but I think in Brussels at Argos Gallery.
Yeah, I was going to say the project Bouillon, which I find hard to pronounce, the rough draft. You did an extraordinary performance with another artist's work where you were using all those phrases live, improvised, which really struck me and was a precursor to the work you did together when we did the If Tate Modern was Musée de la Danse project in 2015.
So it's sort of been a long journey of developing strategies to work with those text fragments in different formats and different relations. And probably a big cornerstone was the work in Expo Zero, which is Boris's project, where I was just sort of, everybody in that project is, you know, doing their own thing basically, and the thing I was doing was working with a set of fragments that I identified as having some sort of currency in the particular context of Musée de la Danse, and also Tate, with a sort of flowing audience of, you know, some people who knew what they were coming to, and other people who were just wandering in and being confused. And the sort of text that I was working with became a sort of tool that I could sort of throw into that situation and activate things in different ways.
It's going to describe the scenario a little bit of Expo Zero, which is an ongoing project you'd worked on with Boris Sharmatz, but it's a kind of empty gallery situation with only performers' bodies and audience bodies, and no other objects. And then each artist within it makes a proposition for some sort of performance or interaction, don't they? So there were various things, choreographic improvisation, storytelling by Sung-Hwan Kim, and you were kind of fielding the entrance lobby space with moving words in this extraordinary way, sort of blocking and enticing and reinterpreting this set of words. I don't know how many words it is. It's about 10 lines, isn't it?
Yeah.
You were doing it for 5 hours a day, reinterpreting those phrases. And this is the piece that we came on to acquire. But the experience of that was very strong for me to encounter it, and I know for the public that saw it as well, or the people that saw it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that interested me was that I have this archive of fragments of language that I've collected, let's say, or written, and it gets used when I'm working on texts. It gets used when I'm looking for material for the neon sculptures or the drawings that I do. But a large part of it, in a way, just sort of sits there as an accumulating sort of sediment. And one of the things that interested me in starting to work with that material performatively was, I suppose, this idea of testing the language by speaking it out. So in a sense, investigating that material by declaring it or whispering it or yelling it or saying it conversationally, and in a way trying to understand what any of those phrases that I've collected might be in a situation, and what can I do with them, and what can they open up in terms of a relation or a dialogue or an encounter with other people. And that work, in the context of something like Musique de la Danse, was quite interesting, because you've got an audience that's very mobile and flowing, and you've got other artists who are doing things, and it becomes a sort of a very lively zone in which one could be working with those texts in so many different ways, and opening up different possibilities with people, sometimes very directly, to try to make a kind of intimate contact with somebody as they enter the space, or to address them from the far side of the room yelling, or to be just in a corner on my own repeating and whispering some set of those fragments. It's all part of a kind of an impulse to use the language as a way of opening and testing relation, and playing with the possibilities of what is possible within this sort of limited sort of form. And I think people can see that in the work, because they can see that I'm working with a very restricted palette of language. So they sense that I'm, in a way, playing with and pushing at what the borders of that language are, and what kinds of things it can open up. And then the transition to the piece Moving Words, which is sort of, in a sense, accumulated out of this improvising practice, has been that I also began to get interested in the idea of, okay, I'm activating those sentences, and when I activate them, I have a set of interests and qualities as a performer. I'm me. I've got my presence. I've got my body. I've got my gender. I've got my race. What happens if you transfer that? If you transfer those texts to another person, who will have a different presence, and maybe different from me in all sorts of other ways, and that's really exciting to me. I think the idea that score, so it's 13 individual phrases, becomes a material that other people could activate. That's an excitement to me, and the key thing I remember from our discussions was sort of, in a way, getting to the point where we could say that, I mean, because I like how I work with that material, but I'm also sort of intrigued by what other people can do with it. So it's getting to the point of being able to say, actually, the strength of the work is that when other people manifest it, it will be different.
Well, yeah.
Plus, in a way, it could never be that one would think, oh yeah, but Tim can do that differently and somehow better. I'm more interested in the idea that actually every person that activates that score, and I will, I'll work with people on developing strategies for it. But it excites me to think that if different people manifest it, that they will do it differently. That they'll find things that I can't find.
Well, I was going to say, as we were thinking back on how you iterated the piece within the frame of Musée de la Danse, and there was a thrill in your skill at improvisation. And this is one of the things that's been a feature of these meeting points between dance proper, choreography proper, theatre proper, and visual art, vis-a-vis that kind of clash of the de-skilled history of performance art with the skilled things that you bring as someone who can improvise in that way, with a theatre dimension, and also the way that Boris posed the Musée de la Danse as a collection of people's skills, actually, whether it's ballet or Irish dancing or, that was fascinating for me. And I think that's been part of a process in the past decade and more, that visual art has been seeking those points of contact with other disciplines, muddling those boundaries, not just using kind of ready-made approximations of theatre, in inverted commas, or dance by visual artists, but really having those conversations with practitioners moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's the, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, in relation to what you just said, I feel that was the thing we ended up talking about the most in terms of, at the beginning stages, how we might collect it, because with some of the artist performances we've collected who are coming from a more sculptural practice like Amalia Pica or Roman Ondak, the work's instructions, or David Lamelas, are quite straightforwardly executable. You stand in a line and do this, or you hold up, in Amalia Pica's piece, two people holding up the string of bunting, or they're to make an image in a quite a straightforward way. With your work, it falls in between. I don't know if when we need to break for the clapping, but I was thinking about Pip Lawrenson, who's done this amazing work, originally from a conservation point of view, on enabling us to collect performance at Tate. And she's the one who initiated this Reshaping the Collectible project now about time-based media. And she quotes Nelson Goodman talking about the difference in collecting between autographic and allographic works. Autographic being the ones that are the moment of execution and creation are the same, i.e. like a gestural painting, and allographic being more like a musical score which needs interpretation. And in a way, the problem we got to straight away with your work is that you were both of those things, because at first it seemed hard at first to get around your skill as an improviser in making those words become something in the space, and envisaging its life in 100-year term that the museum needs to look at to acquire it.
I understand that, and I'm aware that I bring a very particular set of, I don't know if I would call them skills, but I bring some qualities to the work, some of which come from theatre and some of which really come from actually my interest, I would say, in visual art and in sound art.
Well, that's true. I mean, there are no boundaries here, but
yeah. But I think for sure it's interesting that certain works, you could say, are enactable in a fairly straightforward way, and maybe other ones require more complex ways of thinking about performance and so on. We should go and clap.
Yes, I was going to just say it's 1 minute too. So let's just take a kind of 5-minute break, and we will come back and try and pick up right where we left off.
Yes.
um,
we were talking about the difficulty of acquiring Tim to improvise. And since we can't, just how to transpose the score into something with longevity and something that doesn't rely. I mean, this has been a feature of our discussions with conservation about acquiring performance generally, including Tino Segal's work, for example, early on as well. To what extent can instructions for work that is nuanced in its direction or its use of improvisation through the character of the performer, how much can you, even though we now have a category for performance in the database and we're much better equipped for technically acquiring it, and our conservation department are amazing at being open-minded about what time-based media is, but these things that rely on the nuance of artistic decision making, how can they be written down and recorded? And there are ways that choreographers have done it, like instructional videos that combine description with a recorded document of how the dance is supposed to look, for example. But yeah, Tim, maybe you could say something about your parameters, I guess, because you're very open and willing to see those words interpreted in ways other than how you would do it. But could you say anything about your sense of creative parameters, I guess, how to explain that, how you talk to conservation about that kind of thing? Because maybe being too open isn't helpful either for somebody coming.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting things. One is, I think for me, it's almost like there's a set of layers to the information. Because I could say in one sense, in the very simplest sense, the work is those 13 phrases and a very simple, let's say, not more than 10 sentences, description of what you can do with them. That's the core of it. And in a way, if I was working with somebody, I might start there, which is like the simplest possible version. But then the other layers are to do with, I've written a fairly lengthy document of me thinking about what I'm doing when I'm working with those phrases. And I've made a video where I'm talking about that and also in a way showing some of the things that I'm doing when I'm working with that material. Plus there's, documentation of me working with that material. So in a sense, anybody coming to it, if I wasn't around, at some point in the future, as I certainly won't be, then there's sort of like a set of layers of information. And I think, if you're a performer, you certainly need the first layer. And I think you probably look at the second and the third layers and the fourth layers, and take from them what you can. But you both don't. You don't want too little information. Maybe you certainly don't want too much. So it's sort of where do you put yourself as a person encountering the work?
Because you don't want that forensic attempt for someone to try to be you and emulate. Any sort of reconstruction in a way gets killed by that, doesn't it?
That will be horrible. So I think it's how do you give tools that are going to be useful. I suppose that's also something that, in the work with Forced Entertainment and many of the other collaborations that I've done in different contexts, in dance or in gallery performance, that's something I have experience of as well. So it's interesting to me to think about how do you layer and structure the information in a way that allows for a process to take place between another person and the material, which isn't a straitjacket or a sort of such a heavy burden of data that you wouldn't be able to move. That's interesting. But I wanted to go back just a little bit to that thought about the complexity of a work like this one, versus the sort of apparently straightforwardness of say Roman on deck. The cue is the one that I always think about of Romans. See, I don't know. I mean,
I wasn't. Yes, I'm not saying it's a simple.
Down,
I'm not saying it's a simple work.
No, that's the thing. You know, I think there's nuance everywhere.
Yeah.
There's always nuance, and you could always look at a manifestation of a work and say, well, the energy performance-wise, or the detail performance-wise, or the approach performance-wise, maybe could have been a bit more this way or that way. I mean, I don't know if you saw. I saw some of the Pina Bausch Bluebeard's pieces at Sadlerswell's recently, which, okay, it's coming from Dan's, but it's the Pina company with new performers trained by the people who originally did the roles. And even as somebody who, you know, doesn't know the original piece except from the video, you could still look at it and have an opinion about how well or not well people were doing their work. I mean, you know, it's always nuance wherever you look. So I'm not sure that there's any work that escapes this question of basically the detail of how it's manifested in performance matters. It's always going to matter. It matters in my work, but it will matter in Roman's work too, and in Tino.
I completely agree. It's just he is giving us a score that is more about behaving in an ordinary way in a cue. That's what I mean. It's just a slightly more simple instruction for the actors, I guess. I mean, it's more, I could do that, whereas I couldn't do yours, let's put it that way. I could never, I think there are degrees of, you know, elaboration required.
I don't know.
People do it very well, the cue, and they, you know, it's a piece for 12 actors who pretending to be in a queue, and they queue anywhere in a within the museum, but they're not actually queuing for anything. So
but I could find you 1,000 actors who could not stand in a queue.
You know more about actors than me. Maybe that's true. Yes, maybe they're overacting the cue.
Oh my God! You know, I would have nightmares on that. I just don't take it for granted that a simple instruction.
Actually, no, I do know what you mean, and it's been very interesting on the art performance side, and what I said about de-skilling, to work with somebody like Joan Jonas, reconstructing her pieces like Mirror Piece 2 and Song Delay with us. How she deliberately she showed the people that we'd cast to be the performers, who came from different dance, art, theatre backgrounds. She demonstrated the attitude she wanted, which was a certain kind of de-skilled, neutral way of walking and doing things, which is quite hard to do, you know, and it did need demonstrating. So you're right, to not act too much is definitely a visual art skill that's important as well. Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think your work also with forced entertainment and the way you're describing it there, you know, one of the extraordinary things you do is create frameworks that allow people to show their subjectivity and their character and their ideas and skill at improvisation. And I was thinking about Quizula, that the ongoing piece you've made as a kind of dialogue duet, asking each other questions, which is absolutely fantastic piece. I mean, and I was thinking particularly about that at this moment where everybody's starting to put content online, QED, and how you've also tried that online. And I wondered, you know, in this strange moment where we're in, what your thoughts are about live, how important live presence is, and how that piece worked online. I mean, it's not the only one you've done that in various ways, but I feel like maybe there's a bit of a frenetic thing going on right now, which we're part of, maybe, but of everybody saying things haven't finished, it's fine, we can do it all online. And there are obviously major differences in terms of like the density of experience and your attention span and things like that. But what's your experience been in that regard?
I mean, we made our first durational piece in 1993. We did a 12-hour performance at the National Review of Live Art, which was at the ICA that year. And when we did that, we were sort of influenced, of course, by other things that we'd seen, which were probably coming more from performance art. So I remember seeing Alistair MacLennan in the CCA gallery in Glasgow, Third Eye Centre, probably at the time, on a sort of 72-hour long performance. And just sort of really getting into this idea that you could have a work where people came and went, and where you went in, and then when you came out, the thing lingered with you, and then you went back in the next day and you were still in there, still doing all these things. And I think that really touched us. We were very young at the time, and I think we wanted to make something that existed in a parallel sort of time dimension. And so when we made Crisula, which was probably 98, I think, when we made that one, the first time, what interested us was this idea of an audience that could come and go, where their attention wasn't necessarily on it all the time. And in a strange way,
24 hours, isn't it?
Originally it was 6, and we did it many times at 6, and then we have twice done 24-hour live stream versions of it. But in a way, live streaming it, it almost felt like live streaming was its natural home, because it had, you know, it had always had that sense of, it's a very focused, intense thing that's going on, but you can always go to the bar and chat with your friends and then come back later. That was how it had always been presented. And in a funny sort of way, that's exactly what online sort of offered to it. Plus, then it also had this sort of sense of the chat room or Twitter alongside it, that people could be commenting or inventing their own answers to the questions, or mocking the performers, or doing all the things that you do. And that was also kind of great for it. It was glorious for it. And I think that work also, because that work it's not like watching a play or a performance that's got a beginning, middle and an end. It's basically more like
it's harder, isn't it? I think
event, in the sense that there's no there isn't a fixed dramaturgy. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. We don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know what question somebody's going to ask me that's going to absolutely floor me and I won't be able to answer it, or it's going to make me laugh out loud like a child because it's such a silly question. Those things are really happening, and the time's really unfolding. So I find it tremendously sort of vivid, and I think the vividness of that really communicates online in a way that live streaming from a theatre, the show that night, I find it a bit like
it's hard, but because the density of attention online and the many places you could go are so different than sitting together, aren't they, in a real space, I think.
Yeah, and I like this idea that the Crisula, the live stream stuff that we've done, which is we've only ever live streamed the long pieces, and I love that they become then these sort of companion sort of screens that people took on the bus or
live with for a short time.
Yeah, switched in, switched out. Or spent the whole evening drinking and watching with their friends online in different places. It just seemed pertinent, really, that work to that moment. And maybe we'll go back to something of that in this lockdown period. At the moment, it does feel as though everybody's sort of shoveling everything online a bit willy-nilly. I'm not sure that that's particularly wise or sustainable. So we've been rather taking our time, I think. There's definitely things we'll do, but we haven't been.
It feels, we did a series at Tate in the past few years called Performance Room that was 2-camera,
Yes.
trying to, in a way, address the fact that often what you would be seeing online is second-hand documentation. So that series, BMW Tate Modern, was designed specifically for online viewers, because we have a big audience at Tate who are, and actually I thought about doing it when I was on maternity leave, when I was in lockdown, and trying to watch things online and always sort of seeing the documentation over somebody's head and thinking this is all a bit secondhand generally. So I think quality is a question, but in terms of what you were just saying actually about how one lives with the technology, I think that's really interesting. And in a way, your 24-hour Quizula approach is more like what Dorothea von Hantelmann distinguishes from, you know, she talks in her text that was used actually at the opening of The Shed, but it's her ongoing research. She writes about appointment time, theatre as appointment time, where you turn up for the event, and then gallery time performance, which is the ambient mode you can come in and out of, which is the sort of, you know, and also what you did with Musée de la Danse. And in a way, that approach to online is conflating the two. Well, it's neither in a way, but maybe it's the kind of trying to do event time online in the same way as theatre is what doesn't work terribly well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely tricky, because it demands. Maybe it's also about control of sort of dramaturgy. You know, when you sit an audience down in a theatre for an hour or two, you're in control of the arc of what happens, and that's what you're sculpting, really. You know, you're trying to take people on a journey or on a curve or on a flat line, you know, but you're trying to control that. And the interesting thing with the long pieces that we've done, the improvised ones, is that you don't control that, because the line is too long at 6, 12 or 24 hours. You can't really make a shape, not quite anyway. And also you don't know when people will arrive and when they'll leave. And that's kind of great, you know, because as a theatre maker, you're obsessed with beginning, middle, end, and all of that. And suddenly when you say, well, it's 6 hours long, who knows when people are arriving? It's a tremendous liberation. And same with
like Moving Words worked so well in the gallery. It's got that, is it Joe Kelleher, the theorist, who said you're always on time for a painting. But you're also, the way you did the 5-hour version of Moving Words was the same thing. And you dealt with it live as well, people coming in and out. But you've with the acquisition, you've specified 2 modes to it, haven't you? Because there is also an event mode. There's a gallery mode, and potentially.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's how I think about those works. I think I can work with that material for a short time. It might be, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, could even be half an hour, which in a sense then one's working with the material to make a shape, to take probably a fixed audience on a particular improvised journey with that material. Or I can think about it as a set of materials that I could activate or somebody else could activate in the gallery for a whole day or for a whole series of days. That becomes something in a way quite different, because you're not controlling the time, you're not making this shape, but you are basically you're treating the gallery like an experimental test bed in which the material is being worked. I did a funny thing. I did another project with Boris in Valencia. We did his 20 dancers for the 20th century, which he also did at Tate. And he asked me to take part in it. And I just took the 2 words, Moving Words. And I did 4 hours in one room of the gallery, no breaks, just
with 2 words.
moving words, moving words, moving words.
Goodness.
Moving words,
Wow.
the world's moving. And sometimes just lying on the floor, whispering it to myself, sometimes really meeting people and trying to tell them about it. Sometimes pacing the room like a maniac. It was kind of glorious just to live inside that material for 4 or 5 hours, however long it was.
You're dealing with lockdown fine after. That's how extraordinary that you could keep going with that. Wow. Well, I've seen you in action. I know you can, but I wish I'd seen that. Could you say something before because I think we're probably about to open it to questions, but could you say something about what the gallery situation gives you? Because there have been lots of these, like I said, movements between the disciplinaries that we've set up in a Western context, mainly to say that's theatre, that's dance, and that's art, which don't hold in so many ways. But what is it you like about the art context or the frame, or sort of moving into that frame?
I mean, partly, in terms of performance, I think it's this an openness and maybe a looseness about time. And in theatre you bring a group of people together at 8 o'clock and you're sort of in this contract with them whereby you're going to take them on a journey until 9:30 or something, and that's great, but it's also tyrannous in the extreme, and a lot of forced entertainment's work has been sort of in a way pushing against the tyranny of that arrangement, whilst also occupying it. And I think the gallery, on one hand, has sort of, for me, been a space where one can do things that don't adhere to the same sort of dramaturgical and attention economy kind of rules. So it can be like, Quizula can be a bit boring for a while, but it will be interesting in a bit. And that's great. It's very hard to do. You can do that in the theatre if you want to, but it's hard. I think the other thing that interests me is, it's funny because I've spent so much of my life doing live work, and where in a sense the work only exists because you've travelled somewhere to do it, and so on. I have to say, and it's kind of funny to say this, but one of the things I like about working in the gallery is that the objects can do the talking. I like that it can be some drawings, or it can be
obviously you make drawings too, and
or I like that it can be a neon work or a video, or and I like that I'm not there. I like that the object is the thing that starts the relation or makes the proposition. I still think about it in quite similar ways, but I actually like the fact that, I mean, it's also about being a writer. So I've written fiction. I like that the books travel and have a life that's independent of mine. That I can meet somebody who says, "Oh, I read that book 5 years ago," and I can be like, "Wow." Normally, if people have seen shows, I was there, so I might have met them. Like I'm aware of all the circumstances under which the work's been presented. And the interesting thing to me about objects, which the gallery gives you in a sense, is that they circulate independently and they have a capacity to generate conversations when you are not present. And I do like that.
May become more and more important in the present moment.
Yeah.
Also, sure. And being collected will do that in a different way too, obviously.
Yeah.
So I think we are going to open up to questions, but on that note, I just wanted to ask a very quick question before we do that. And just what will happen, by the way, is that anybody that is in the Zoom seminar, you can somehow, I'm not quite sure what it looks like on your on the thing that you can see, but you should be able to raise your hand. And when you raise your hand, it should, in fact, somebody has just typed me a question, but you can either type me a question or you can raise your hand and then I can open up your mic and you can do it. So whilst we kind of figure out how that is, one thing I wanted to ask just quickly, which kind of follows on from what you were saying, I was thinking a bit about the idea of like how you would loan the work, or how you would think about that work circulating once it exists in the collection. And so I wondered, just really briefly, if you could kind of really practically sort of tell us like what the material in the collection is for the work.
Do you want me, shall I talk about that,
Well,
Catherine?
both of you either, yeah.
Maybe you could start with the words, and I could say something about the processes on the Tate side. I don't.
Yeah. Well, so what the Tate will have is the score, which consists of 13 A5 cards, which are have drawings on them, which are the phrases of the text, basically. And so that is that's the raw materials, if you like. And then it's just a bunch of documents which are the set of rules or formulas or serving suggestions for by which those phrases, that score can be activated. And initially the idea will be that I will do some performances of the piece, hopefully at Tate, and also that I will be involved in training some other people to do it. But ultimately the materials should stand alone. I mean, they will have to, because I will die and everybody that I can train will die eventually.
Always a weird conversation we have to have in acquiring these works. Yeah.
That's how it is, isn't it?
It is, yeah. That we have to confront our mortality in acquiring performance particularly. But I don't know whether you've done it yet, Tim, but the usual process of a accession interview with conservation, where a lot of that nuance would be gone through so that it can be recorded on TMS, on the museum database, and in the conservation records very accurately.
Yeah.
Isabella's written a very nice, the APF, the acquisition document that will be used as a source about the work that we'd all refer to.
Yeah.
But then more detail about, like, in a way, the first time that we show the work and we work with you to either for you to perform it or for you to audition and cast other people to do it, which would be ideal to do sooner rather than later, alongside you doing it. That's when we should make a lot of notes about that side of the process as well.
Yeah.
Time-based media conservators.
Yeah.
So this is a question from Arash, which says, how do you see the concept of the rehearsal in performance by visual artists? So he's kind of directing this towards you, Catherine, but I think actually there's probably something kind of about what you've just been talking about as well in there. So he says, I'm asking because rehearsal is coming from the theatre as an idea, and a form, and this idea of kind of repeating to master something, but very often, and I guess very often the kind of visual art performances are more rehearsed. How much are you seeing the idea of rehearsal in the kind of theatre sense in the visual arts, and how much are you seeing more kind of ideas of, I guess, improvisation or kind of development in different ways?
It's a really good question. I'd like to hear what Tim says about it too. But in the history of performance art proper, I guess, in America and Europe, there was, like I said, this de-skilled tendency towards one-off actions like Chris Burden being shot in the arm, or Marina Abramovich rhythm, things that were kind of unrepeatable, unrehearsed, about the vulnerability of the body, that kind of work. We cannot collect those kinds of works because because of their unrepeatability, unrehearsability. So that kind of body art that was about the authentic moment of the artist experiencing pain or duration or some kind of experiential passage, we usually represent in the collection through documentation or photography or video, because it's the only way. It's more the works like Joan Jonas's mirror piece or the Lamelas piece called Time. I wouldn't say they're necessarily, well, they're scores that are repeatable and rehearsable to some extent. And I think there really are different kinds of approach by artists in the spectrum of what we represent in the collection. But it's true that some work is more collectible than other. When we did the Rauschenberg retrospective, we talked with the Rauschenberg estate about whether there was any possibility of restaging his performances like Pelican, and they said absolutely. I mean, it's already clear in a way, but they just said absolutely no way. It was about him doing it, him roller skating with the parachute silk on his back. You know, he was making it as a live painting. It was about his presence, and it wouldn't make sense. It was him and his friends experimenting and trying things. It wouldn't make sense to do a forensic reconstruction of what it looked like, because you don't get the spirit of it.
Yeah, yeah.
But Tim, what are your...
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think about it according to the project, really. I mean, there's definitely projects that I have where there's no rehearsal. There's only having a decision about what you're going to do and then doing it. And a lot of the kind of work with fragments of text that I'm talking about, that Moving Words is a part of, I would say that has come from that route. It's more about having a frame and jumping into it and activating that frame, certainly not about rehearsing. But then there are also, you know, many works where, certainly with forced entertainment, where there's extremely laborious rehearsal. So for me, it's a spectrum. It's to do with what do you need to do in order to do that thing. And I like both. I don't think there's an ideological kind of split between them. I just think it's about the nature of the thing that you're trying to construct. I mean, maybe the other interesting thing to think about is you might not rehearse, but you probably want to be familiar with the behaviors and the properties of the materials that you're working with. You know, if you're gonna do something with clay or with materials, even with language as a material, you sort of, it's not about practicing so you're going to do it the same, but in a sense you need to know how the thing behaves. Otherwise the danger is that you you just plunge in and nothing happens, you know. So I think for me there's preparation, and there's rehearsal, and it can be anything.
I was going to say the word composition is important, I think. In terms of art performance, I remember being surprised when I first came across drawings in the Tate collection by the Vienna actionist Günter Bruss, where all of the actionists were making those apparently wild kind of explosions of paint and blood and cuts and naked bodies, and they look really free and experimental. And then they'd all done these extremely elaborate drawings, sequence by sequence, frame by frame, of how those actions would be played out, in fact. He and Otto Mühl and Hermann Nitsch. So I think often from an art performance point of view, artists are used to painting or making sculpture and composing, and like you say, Tim, it's about knowing your performers or your materials and working with them to arrange and compose images.
Yeah, might not be about
not just images, but
thing, but
themes.
Yeah.
That's certainly how Joan Jonas works, I would say, or Pablo Bronstein, who I've worked with a lot. It's that interface between drawing practice cultural practices and choreography or acting?
Yeah, I mean, we had a nice question after we did the 24-hour Quizula in 2014 at the Barbican, and we live streamed it from there. And afterwards we were talking with one of the programmers, and she said, oh, how do you rehearse for this? And I said, well, we don't rehearse. And Richard, who's one of the performers, said, yeah, but in another way, we've been rehearsing for it for 32 years, which is the length of time of the company's kind of existence as a collaboration artistically. And all of that knowledge of each other, of time and timing and of performative dynamics, that's what you carry in. You know, one of the other things I always think about is, you know, not rehearsing, but preparing. You can't rehearse a football match, but you do prepare. You do try to get to know your teammates, and you need to understand what the frame of the game is. You might look at the opponent's track record. There's lots of things you can do that aren't rehearsing, that are about putting yourself in a good position to do the thing that you're going to do.
I think we've got time for one more, and John has been very patiently waiting with his hand up. So do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Rose. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So, Tim, this is a question for you, really. It's no accident that both you and Catherine appear in front of impressive shelves of books. And I was wondering if you could speak to the difference when it's Tate collecting and the deep well of knowledge and sensitivity that comes with that, and clearly an institution that takes its custodian responsibilities very seriously, and an obviously good association for you. Are there different considerations when you're selling a work to a private collector, say, or a foundation? And are there people you wouldn't sell to at all?
I mean, in terms of performance, that hasn't. Just trying to think, that hasn't actually arisen. So it would be an interesting scenario. I mean, I think one of the great things about Tate acquiring this work is exactly what you say, that there's the machinery of the institution, the seriousness with which they take the whole question of performance itself, but also, you know, legacy and the longevity of the work in the collection. I can feel, you know, very excited and happy that that work will be there, where, yeah, you might think differently about in another context, but it hasn't arisen. I mean, the works of mine are owned by institutions and individuals, but they're not performances. They tend to be more the neons or the drawings or whatever. And there, I think the only grounds I wouldn't let anybody acquire would be on ethical grounds, really. And again, that's not arisen, but I can definitely imagine situations where I wouldn't want to be in certain collections or owned by particular collectors.
Because as I understand it, the whole point of this performance exchange initiative, which I think is great, is that hopefully you'll have this problem to think about very soon.
Yeah, well, that would be great to have to think about that question. I think as far as I understand it, the idea with performance exchange is that, you know, there's a lot of work circulating there, and several galleries, institutions that might then acquire one or another of those pieces, which is great. I think, you know, for me, it's also interesting to think about how you disseminate not just the work, but also the knowledge and the thinking that's coming from Tate in this case, and from Performance Exchange, just to think about what it might be archivally and institutionally to commit to holding performance in the collection. It's sort of about that knowledge spread as well, I think.
Actually, may I just add on that point, it's really, what does trying to collect this kind of work do to the institution? Because it presses on the institution, it forces change. It's not coming quietly, you know. it's actually making us make new categories and new ways of working with artists and performers, and new ways of having displays, different timescales, different kinds of encounter. It's also, what's been really interesting is how much it's paved the way for some of our global or transnational collecting strategies from contexts where they aren't invested in the same kind of disciplinary boundaries that Western modernism is founded on. So in a way, collecting performance has broken ground for imagining a different kind of museum that isn't a white cube display model in the same way. And I think that's going to be a very interesting phase as we go from here in relation to Indigenous practices, artists like Tanya Lukin Linklater, who was supposed to be on right now in the tanks, hopefully will be later, but artists working with, you know, performance and choreography from that point of view too, in ways that don't fit in a kind of typical Tate display exhibition mode. I think there's much more to do, let's put it that way.
And I mean, I think for performance exchange, it was also sort of just starting with the idea that exactly that performance was becoming more and more part of a kind of integrated set of practices as well. So it wasn't that you were necessarily seeing artists who were like only invested in making work with their body or work that was live, but also kind of translating that from a live moment to even a sculpture or a painting or a ceramic, and how to kind of talk about the performance within those processes and within that kind of constellation. And I guess in particular, like within the market situation, where it felt like there were kind of bits of artists' practice that were able to go off and circulate in one context, and bits of their practice that were completely kind of left behind by that and not able to, and that when those things were divorced, you kind of lost something. So it was as much about that idea of kind of tethering like those material and those live moments together, and being able to kind of understand how you needed all of them to understand the practice, that was kind of a motivation
really
from us.
I think that's really important in the history of 20th century art, I have to say. You know, Gutai, we thought Gutai was some abstract expressionist paintings that looked a bit like American abstract expressionism, and then you look at Gutai on the stage in the theatre from the late 1950s, it's absolutely incredible expanded practice where of the painting was a tiny part. So I think there's a huge revisionism going on there too, and still happening, to understand what you said about contemporary practice is really reaches back.
Yes, yeah, sure. And I think, you know, in that sense, it's also, I mean, even when you're talking about performance in a kind of purer sense, it's just, for us, it was about like whether or not you're talking about a museum or whether or not you were talking about a private collector. A lot of what you're talking about is just a kind of sense of confidence with that practice in those ways. It's not necessarily all that complex every single time, but it is different every single time. And so you have to kind of create a kind of transparency around that, whereby people feel like they just kind of can get to grips with what they're collecting and how it would function, you know, both within their collection, but also say if they wanted to sell it on, or if they wanted to loan it, or all of those things that you know have different kind of applications in museums and in the market, but nevertheless require you to kind of have a sense of what the kind of container that the practice sits in is.
Yeah. That's true. And I'm looking at what Adam Moore has written also, and thinking that, you know, one of the other interesting things for me is that it's to try to think about building a context where performance is understood as an integral part of practice and processes that artists are using, rather than a bit of kind of magic pixie dust that people can sprinkle on the top of an exhibition or an event, which I think, you know, I'm fairly cynical about the performative turn, as they call it, because I think it's not entirely, but it's quite substantially been guilty of that sense of, you know, performance as the sort of bit of razzmatazz that you sort of add to the opening event. I'm not talking about you, Catherine, but I'm talking about.
I have resisted that tendency as much as possible.
It can be like that, and I think it's not helpful to sort of understanding what artists are doing with performance and the depth of connection between performance and all of the other aspects of people's work. And I think it doesn't do anybody any favors. So in a way, I'll be glad when it's over, because I think that sort of slightly hypey magical pixie dust thing is, I don't think it really does anybody any favors, basically.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple more questions that have been typed. Holly says that we're slightly kind of slow on picking up on these, I see now, but Holly has kind of has mentioned something about going back to the Rauschenberg example and this idea of if it can't be recreated and museumified, how does that skew the kind of performance in the collection? And I guess the second half of that question, which is more about performance exchange and whether or not that kind of restricts the type of performance that we're disseminating, which I guess is a sort of mirror bit of the question, really. I suppose I would say from performance exchange's point of view, in some respects, the answer to that is yes, of course it does. I mean, but you're never going to kind of represent every single type of performance in one program. But also I think what we wanted to do was to talk about the way that one of the things that we wanted to do was to talk about the way that commercial galleries do actually represent a lot of performance, or a lot of artists who have performance in their practice. And again, you know, in terms of kind of understanding how to create confidence around representing that kind of work, and that might itself be something that would be a catalyst to them being able to take on different types of practices. I mean, certainly a lot of the artists that I know and have worked with, I've heard countless stories where it's like, yeah, this gallery got in touch with me and we had a conversation and it but at the end, they didn't quite know what they would do with me. and so, you know, that kind of like chicken and egg thing of like, yeah, we're interested in the practice.
Yeah.
Go on.
No, I think you're right. And even some artists with high profiles getting big commissions and things still can't make that commercial dimension of the practice work for the market, because people aren't necessarily willing to take that risk and they don't have models to look at where it could be done. So I think that is really important. With the Rauschenberg, in the exhibition, we represented those works by the beautiful Peter Moore photographs and the video that exists. And I think you still get a sense of how Rauschenberg was working with Merce Cunningham and others to make these compositions from the documentation. So I think you can still share that work in the story of art history. It's just not necessarily live, it's in other formats. But we are acquiring a collaborative work between Rauschenberg and Trisha Brown and Laurie Anderson, which could be both live and shown as a documentation or installation as well. So I think, I think there are lots of interesting shifts in status of material that have been going on, because 10 years ago, Charlie Atlas was known more as the person who made documentary films of Merce Cunningham or Lee Bowery or Michael Clark, and he now shows that work in its own right all over the world, and it gets recognized as a counterpart to the work of those choreographers and dancers and artists. So I think there's been a shift in the status of what it means to show what was known as just documentation, actually, and that being recognized as well.
Yeah.
There are kind of this kind of ongoing sort of trickle of questions coming in. I think there's maybe we've got time for one more. I don't know whether you guys can see the kind of remaining, Catherine and Tim, whether you can see the kind of remaining questions.
What about lockdown and the authorities? Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Curating the body. Yeah, really interesting comment on the sediment.
I mean, there's a question
Yeah.
from, I don't know if everybody can read these questions or if it's only us that can see them, but questions from Constance Whittam. Given the present lockdown situation, isn't the authority of the institution destabilized? And if we have to confront a future where institutions are no longer to host work, i.e. all public venues, yeah, that's a great question, I think. And yeah, obviously we're all really wondering about the shape of the world that we come out of this into. And it seems like an opportunity in some ways, awful as it is, this situation, to maybe rethink what's valuable and what matters and what kinds of structures and relations are possible. It also seems politically, I'm talking about, you know, in terms of society and in terms of what matters, it feels like now's a moment where we're confronted by a kind of, you know, it's a kind of exaggerated version of the inequalities and the difficulties that our society has, in terms of who can afford not to work, whose work requires them to go on public transport into a place, whose work can be done from home, the economy, who's paid what, all of these things are super, you know, obviously it's on all of our minds, I think, what this is revealing, and also what world can we come out of this to. And I think we're all, well, I assume we're all thinking hard about that. It's hard to think about anything else, really. And I think what emerges in terms of networks of conversation and presentation and dialogue between artists and institutions, and yeah, what we build in this time and how we think about the future is super important, I think. And I think it's way early to know how that's all going to pan out, but it's for sure that, you know, even as society can stagger back into public sometime, flooding into theatres and cinemas or crowded galleries might not be a first thing on people's minds, just because of the contagion possibilities that are inherent in those spaces. So I wonder, I really do, what public space and what social space and what political space we will be in on the other side of all this.
Although I think, I mean, one thing I would say is, you know, even last weekend, it was fascinating how the parks were rammer jam, and, you know, the kind of like, you know, the desire and the need for people to kind of be with each other and to connect and to sort of just socialize, I guess, felt very strong. And even like, you know, there was a performance at Arcade Gallery that I went to that was like, you know, the night before the lockdown, and everybody was kind of like, oh, we're here because it's the last chance we're going to get to kind of do anything and see and be together and socialize and see a performance, you know, for who knows how long. So it may also be that actually, you know, the desire for those spaces and the need for those kind of connections becomes, you know, actually, you know, like really manifest as soon as they are reopen. Everybody kind of goes, oh, we can get back in.
Yeah,
it's hard to imagine, you know, I'd start thinking very long term about the history of human civilization. I mean, everything is built on gathering and interaction, isn't it? There is no human culture without it. It's just what format it's going to take. And online seems a bit like a thin alternative, I have to say, you know, in many ways. But say with Tate, in terms of institutional authority, to answer very specifically, it is interesting that actually already you can separate what happens on site at Tate from its online audience. There's a much bigger audience online for Tate's content than there is on site anyway, all over the world. And I'm frequently interviewing people in jobs now who know what we do because they've seen it all online. So there are two different things we're talking about in a way. There is this other authority that is online presence that's associated with the building, but it's not identical with it. And maybe that's what we'll be exploring more. But to me, in terms of the work we do, especially in performance, it feels pretty sad to think that gathering in real time won't be a possibility. Let's hope it will.
On that note, I think we've taken up enough of your home time. So I think we will all press off any moment now, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to Catherine and to Tim, and for everybody that's been here and been online with us. It's been a bit of an experiment to see how it would work, but it's been really, really great. So very happy to have been able to give it a go, and thank you very much, and hopefully we will all be able to do it again in real life at some point.
Give each other a hug.
Exactly.
Eventually. Yeah.
One day.
Catherine.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks Rose, and thanks Tim.
Thanks
and everybody.
Listening and asking questions. It's
really good questions. I'm reading the rest of them now.
Thanks so much.
Got to.
Fabulous.
Thanks a lot.
See you soon.